Good evening. My name is Alexander Jones, and I am the boss of the Epsilon Iota Chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. We thank you for attending our Omega Uplift Series number 11, Social Emotional Learning, the Methodology in Urban Communities. Omega men are always hard at work as we continue to answer the many calls around the community. While social emotional learning has been a constant topic of discussion throughout the country over the past 2 years due to this global pandemic, we felt the need to have further conversation to speak about the importance and give a true understanding of this matter. I want to thank our Social Action Committee for putting together this program to keep our community informed. Since the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated was founded on the campus of Howard University 110 years ago, we have been guided by the 4 cardinal principles of manhood, scholarship, perseverance, and uplift. Omega has played and continues to play a vital role in the social and economic growth of our country and enhancing the lives of African Americans. As a fraternity, we operate under 10 nationally mandated programs, which are centralized around issues in our communities. Epsilon Iota Chapter has been a staple by providing service to the greater New Haven community for over 30 years. Before we get started, I would like to share a few reminders. All participants will be muted during this presentation, but we do encourage your active participation by utilizing the chat feature. All questions will be acknowledged at the appropriate time. I would like to take the time to thank our esteemed panelists for agreeing to participate and give their expertise on this very important topic. Our series moderator is a brother who plays many key roles in Omega, not only on a chapter level, but also at district and international levels as well. He is no stranger to the greater New Haven community, where he serves as the head coach to the Wilbur Cross boys varsity basketball team. He is also the co-founder of Storytellers New Haven. He serves as a mentor to the youth, a leader amongst many men, and an advocate for all. We hope you enjoy this program. I will now turn it over to our Social Action Chairman and our Omega Uplift Series moderator, Brother Kevin Wallen.
All right. Thank you, Brother Boslis, for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. And thanks to those who chose to be with us here this evening. We know you could have been anywhere else, but you chose to be here, and we do appreciate that. Tonight, we're going to delve into a topic that has been prevalent for a long time, but has seemingly taken hold and has made its way to the forefront since our return to school from the pandemic. While social emotional learning can be attributed to lots of things, I believe we hear about it mostly in the education field. Upon the return to class, there was an uptick in student behaviors, resulting in fights, upticks in interpersonal behavior, and so forth. And while we dealt with the pandemic, the focus was on the lost learning that schools are going to have to deal with. But not enough attention was being paid to the lost social emotional learning that played itself out in so many different ways once we returned to in-person learning. All in all, I do not believe that the industry, education as an industry, was prepared for this. Our panelists tonight are experts in the field of social emotional learning, and we are glad that they accepted our invitation to share their knowledge and expertise. Each panelist will have the opportunity to share some thoughts via a 10 to 15 minute presentation. After all the panelists have presented, you, the audience, will have the opportunity to ask questions, will be in the base for our question and answer period. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will do our best to present it to the panelists. Our chat will be monitored all evening by Brother Ruel Dixon. So without further ado, let us bring on our first panelist. Mr. Brandon Frame is the Director of Social and Emotional Learning at the Learning Assembly. Brandon is also the founder of The Black Man Can and the author of My First Tie. Brandon, welcome to the show. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Really honored to be here and to share. I'm gonna share my screen and bring us here. Let me share the presentation. So again, I'm really happy to be here. Again, my name is Brandon Frame, Director of Social Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly. And we were planning this out. It was shared that maybe I should go first because it will set the tone for my other 2 panelists who are about to drop the mic with some of the work that they're doing across schools and across communities. And so first, we're just starting with a grounding definition around this work. What is social emotional learning? I have an opportunity to visit. I'm in at least 10 to 12 schools a week and working with schools around social emotional learning. And so one of the things I always start with is asking people, what is their definition? And then I introduce one. So I'm going to introduce one for us here today, that social emotional learning when we're talking about it, because again, people have varying definitions. I'm a doctoral student, so I'm really into research. And so we start with social emotional learning is the process through which children and adults develop the skills, attitudes, and values necessary to understand and manage life tasks, such as cognitive learning, forming relationships, and the flexibility to adapt to challenges and expectations of a complex society. And so you can see this definition is from 1997. And so this work has been going on for a very long time, lots of different iterations. And so as Brother Walton mentioned, we think about that in the context of, one, I just want you to think about, and you can drop in the chat if you want to, but how does this align to what you thought social emotional learning was? And then to what he mentioned to, what about social emotional learning feels most relevant to the COVID crisis that we've all experienced? And so when I think about this, I like to situate it with a synonym, right? So there's this wonderful definition here. And one thing I really like to pull out in terms of a synonym when we talk about social emotional learning is skill development, right? And we're talking about students having the opportunity to develop skills such as self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, optimistic thinking. And so we have to situate that in terms of skill development. Many of us that maybe are tuned in, when we think about those type of skills, they weren't explicitly or intentionally taught to us in the K through 12 education setting. It's something that you experience just through life, and you were able to develop and work on those skills, where that no longer can be the case. It was no longer the case for a very long time. The pandemic has just highlighted and heightened the awareness that we have to make sure that everyone's on board with developing social emotional skills for our young people. And it's most important that we do this also from a culturally sustaining approach, because we know that if SEL programs and SEL social emotional learning is not done from a culturally sustaining approach, it can be used to control versus empower, deter versus develop, and ultimately undermine our students' cultural grounding. When I think about this community that here is New Haven, right? And very diverse community. And so we have to make sure that we're thinking about the culturally sustaining approach to developing students' social emotional skills. So then that brings us to a little bit of what is culturally competent social emotional learning. So I'm gonna drop a few things here. And in the chat, you can read this. I'll read out a few, and in the chat, you can drop in which of the above most resonates with you. But when we think about this, right, we think about how can we make sure that social emotional learning views students' backgrounds and communities as a strength, right? We think about the community of New Haven. How do we look at all the different aspects and communities that make up New Haven? How do we make sure that students know and schools look at those backgrounds and communities as a strength? And so there's multiple things here. Another one that I really think about as well when we're thinking about developing skills in our students is the focus on the why before the what. So thinking about why do we develop social emotional skills? It's not just to create great climate and culture in our schools, but for students to have skills that allow for them to be successful in life. If you think about as an adult, when somebody that you know may have been fired for something, it's usually for their social emotional skills, right? That they were actually fired for, not necessarily because they couldn't do the job, but it's like, oh, they're not on time. They can't collaborate effectively. And these are all skills, and we have to really move in a way that allows for us to see social emotional learning as skills. So from these definitions, feel free to drop into the chat which number, you don't got to write the whole sentence out, which number really resonates with you. But it's really important that, again, we develop these students, our social emotional skills. So I'm just going to skip here. I'm gonna just drop, like I said, I dropped a lot of research. So I just put this there, but I like to talk a little bit. And then I'm going to turn over to my other panelists. So people will say, why social emotional learning? And I say, why not social emotional learning? And it's because it works. Here you have some research that denotes why and how it works. But I like to tell two stories. One story is way back from 2013. And it was about a young man who went to an amazing school in Washington, D.C., and he was the valedictorian. And by being the valedictorian, what does he earn? He earns a full scholarship. Where does he earn a full scholarship? To Georgetown. But where is he from? He's from Southeast DC, right? And Southeast DC is a lot different than the campus of Georgetown University. And he shares his experience of going into Georgetown and what he struggled with. And the whole expose is on his social emotional skills, because it's not that he couldn't do the work. It's not that he couldn't sit in classroom and write the papers and do all the critical thinking. it was that, oh, this cultural and social capital that exists at Georgetown is different from where I'm from. How do I ask for help? Or as well as he was always the best student, right? And so this is why social emotional learning is important. It's not just about our students who may be most at risk. It's also for students who also do well. Everybody here can think of a person who they know is like extremely smart, or somebody in school that was extremely smart and didn't necessarily have the social emotional skills to accompany their academic giftedness. So that story really resonates with me. And then another story, I visited a program in Dallas, Texas, with this organization called Big Thought. And with Big Thought, I got to meet these young men and women who were in this program. And it was for program students who were on parole because they made a few decisions in life that they shouldn't have, but their opportunity to get back and join society. And I asked the student, I said, what's the benefit of being in this program? What do you gain from it? What do you learn from it? And the student said to me, I hate that I had to do something wrong to learn social emotional skills. And that really sits with me, right? That, oh, wow, it was because you did something wrong that now you're getting intentional and explicit development of social emotional learning skills. So both of those stories highlight why it's good for students who are doing extremely well in terms of the settings and stuff that once they leave our schools, but also students who may not do all the right things and make different decisions, but then is because we didn't focus on their skill development that they may have even made those decisions in the first place. So that's just a little bit there. I'm gonna stop because I know there's lots of questions that'll come, but overall the goal of what I wanted to set the tone with was why social emotional learning, why is it important? Why do we need to make sure we focus on it in our schools is because we are looking to develop the social emotional skills of our young people. If I could give another analogy to put it into place is that I live in New York City, and every day I walk past buildings, fairly tall buildings that they're building, and there's scaffolding. And so I liken that to us as educators and as adults, and scaffolding is us, and the buildings are the students. And so, you're building this building, you have this scaffolding. And so you're there to make sure the building is strong, tall, and talented, because at some point the scaffolding has to come down, right? And so that's all of us, right? Whether we have kids or we're in schools that we're going to graduate our young people into the world. We have kids, they're going to leave your home someday. They're going to have skills so that they can stand tall and talented. And so we might be scaffolding, but again, that scaffolding is coming down. And so it's important for us to make sure we develop our students' social emotional skills so that they can have that capacity to thrive in the world. And even going back to our definition, thrive in the complex society that we live in. That concludes my part, and I'm going to turn it over to my amazing and esteemed panelists to usher us even forward in this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Brandon, for that great information and way to set us off for this evening. So next up, we have Dr. Kelly Hope. Dr. Kelly, or Dr. Hope, is a teacher, adjunct professor, and the owner of the Kelly Corin Unlimited Leadership and Education Consulting Group. So, Dr. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to the men of Omega Sci-Fi for having me be a part of this much needed and great conversation. And so I'm going to spend some time going a little bit further into this conversation, but focusing more specifically on what's going on, specifically as a teacher and at the high school level, and also as an adjunct professor. I sit in a place where I am seeing and experiencing the things that our students, our young people are going through on a daily basis. And so I'm going to be looking at and discussing social emotional learning in the classroom and its effects in the community as well. And so first, just a little bit about myself. I wanted to give a shout out to my alma maters. I received my bachelor's and master's degrees from Southern Connecticut State University and my doctorate degree from Northeastern. And I'm a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And as Kevin mentioned, Mr. Walton mentioned, I am the owner of Kelly Corin Unlimited Education Leadership Consulting Group. And the focus of my consulting company is to educate, equip, and empower students, educators, and educational stakeholders with the tools needed to assess, plan, and implement results-based strategies. So essentially, everything that we're doing here today, it's really rooted and ingrained in what I strive to do and how I strive to be. And in addition, I have a couple of publications, but that's not why we're here. But I wanted to make sure that I shared a little bit about me before I jump into the good stuff. So we're going to trek a little bit. And so I'm going to encourage y'all to come on this journey with me. And so there's three focus areas that I wanted to share with you all this evening. The first is the impact of the pandemic. Mr. Walton mentioned a few things when he opened tonight's discussion. And I also want to talk about social emotional learning as a method. And then I also want to talk about practical applications of social emotional learning. What does it really look like in the classroom? And what could it possibly look like in our communities? And so what's really going on? What's going on in our schools? I had conversations with colleagues and I've had conversations with students across ninth grade all the way up to my college students. And some of the things that they've shared, one student said, I want my teachers to know I'm doing the best I can. This particular student wasn't succeeding academically, but was trying their hardest. And just for clarification purposes, you see letters after the quotation, so that these are random letters that I pulled and added to these quotations. A colleague mentioned, I'm stressed. I don't have time to do anything. My parents got me involved in too much stuff. I have Jack and Jill, practice, homework, volunteering, and by the time I get done, and they continue to ramble. That was actually a student, not one of my colleagues. And then there was a colleague that said, I don't have time to grade. I have to cover classes during my prep period. Most days, students need extra help and come during my lunch break. After school, I have to get my kid and make dinner. And now they want me to make calls to parents on my time. I don't have time for anything. And so this is just an idea and a glimpse as to what teachers and students have been experiencing. One of my college students said to me, can I have an extension? I lost my stepfather and my uncle, and it's taken a toll on my mental health. And they wanted an extension on their assignment. And so I wanted to start with this framing because when we're talking about social and emotional learning and the importance and the impact that it's having on our young people and our adults, it's important for us to, from my perspective, hear from in their voices what they're really experiencing and going through. And so Dr. Tammy Benton said in an interview on NPR that she puts it into perspective, the year, and in some cases, some schools were remote for a year and a half, but that our students were out of school was a year that they didn't have the opportunity for developing the social skills that normally happen during their period of development. And so it's important to note that over the time when students were home, while we were home during the pandemic, it had dramatic impact and effects on our young people as it did adults. And so how has it impacted our young people based on what I'm seeing and so many other educators are seeing? And if you are an educator or you can attest, feel free to drop in the chat box, just letting me know and maybe others that there are some of these things you can definitely attest to witnessing or hearing others talk about. So our young people are experiencing grief, they're experiencing anxiety, depression, uncertainty, disappointment, overwhelm. And as a result of these emotions and these feelings that our young people are experiencing, it translates or manifests in our schools in our lower grades as crying. We're seeing increased violence. We're seeing students that are skipping and cutting classes. There is an increase in bullying and on all levels, disruptive behaviors. And then when you couple that with what we're seeing in the community, theft, vandalism, and then again, increased violence. And so all of this was exacerbated by being quarantined and being home and not having the ability to develop those social skills and the skills that they need to process and understand what they're feeling, what to do if I am feeling uncertain or I'm feeling disappointed or I'm feeling overwhelmed. How can I manage these emotions and feelings? I'm not sure because I've been either in my phone or left to my own devices for a while and I don't know how to manage these feelings. Likewise, teachers are experiencing the same things as many of us are. Grief, anxiety, depression, uncertainty, disappointment, and overwhelm. But how does that show up in the school? There are, in many cases, there's a lack of patience. There's the feeling of being undervalued. We are seeing increased personal days being taken, which ultimately impacts student learning. There is a mass exodus. We hear, if you're paying attention to and reading news reports or watching the news, there is this trend that is forecast that we are going to have major teacher shortages. Teachers are retiring, teachers are leaving the profession. We also have low participation, meaning schools are trying to find teachers to host after school programs so that students can develop and build their social skills. But after teaching and working all day, in many cases, folks just want to go home. And then also, there's this feeling of being overworked, as stated by the colleague, one of the colleagues that I shared earlier. And then in the community, we have resignations. And when I say resignations, I'm referring to community organizations being involved on boards and volunteering for organizations and serving in philanthropic ways in our communities. People are starting to step down and starting to resign from these positions in order to gain some level of balance. There's incivility. In some cases, you have adults and teachers alike who are a little less patient with others, which also shows up in the home based on what students share. Their parents are upset, their parents are stressed, they're overwhelmed, and their lack of patience even in the home. And then fatigue. These are things that, of course, across the board were around prior to the pandemic, but we've seen a heightened, it has increased as a result of the time quarantining. And so how does SEL fit into all this? Based on this information, and one thing I must note in relation to students who are grieving, the CDC released statistics saying that approximately 175,000 young people lost their guardians or their primary caregiver during this time. And so that must be taken into account because it definitely affects how our students show up into our classrooms and also how we educate and how we approach. Brandon mentioned in his talk earlier about having a culturally sustaining approach with SEL. And it's important to note what our students, specifically in urban areas, are experiencing around grief, with loss of loved ones, with loss of friends, the trauma associated with food insecurities, and even in many cases, shelter insecurities. All of these things confirm and support why adopting and implementing social and emotional learning is important. And so there are 5 domains, essentially, in social and emotional learning. And they include self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And so each of these domains are focus areas for teachers, parents, loved ones, community members, for us to be able to begin to gauge not only how we interact with our students and our young people, but also how we interact with each other on a human level. And so when we're thinking about self-awareness, that really keys into how a student processes and recognizes what they're feeling, and then how they manage their feelings. That moves into self-management. How do I respond based on what is happening to me, what's going on around me, my disappointment, my anger about what someone may have said on social media or what someone may have done in the cafeteria? How do I manage my behaviors in response to the various stimuli that I encounter? And so relationship skills focuses on the interaction between people, and responsible decision making is exactly what it sounds like, making sure that our students have the skills they need to take responsibility for the harm they may cause, and that they can take responsibility for the decisions that they make. And so based on these 5 domains, how does it show up in the classroom? Some practical application. And so some of the things in schools we are getting back to in order to build these skills and center what our students are experiencing with change. And specifically, if we think about New Haven, there has been some turnover with administration leadership in the form of principals in some of our schools. And as a result, there's been changes with teachers, and that directly impacts our students and how they engage with one another and some connections that they may have formed. And so one way to apply and begin to get our students to develop these skills is to hold assemblies and town hall meetings in our lessons, in our assignments. And number 2, lessons and assignments is dear to me because I'm a teacher. And one way that happens for me is I'm teaching Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And in the opening scene, if you're familiar with this particular novel, Janie, the female protagonist, the main character, she returns from her voyage and her full life with the love of her life. And as she's returning back to the neighborhood, there's a group of women that are talking about her. And that for me is a prime opportunity for me to have a conversation around self-awareness and self-management. How did Janie respond to these women? How could she have responded? And can you identify or recognize a time when someone may have been talking about you? How did you respond? Would you respond differently? So there are ways for us to be able to connect what we're teaching and the content to social and emotional learning, and that's one way. Check-ins and stress barometers. A lot of the information that I shared or the quotes that I shared earlier came from check-ins. I'll ask students, how are you today? Or sometimes I'll say, what's good? And they will say whatever's on their mind. And I'll also say on a scale from 1 to 5, where are you today? Are you all here and ready to be scholars? Or do you need a day just to relax? Or do you have something you want to talk about? Which leads to circles and roundtables, which is an opportunity for students to just share what's on their minds and hearts. And then one thing I adopt and a lot of my colleagues at my school implement on maybe, if not a monthly basis, maybe every once or twice a quarter, color cards and clarity days. Days when students can come in, and I have coloring books at the high school level where students will color. I'll put on music and they will listen to music. And it's not a day where we're covering content, but it's really a day where they can rest and give their brains time to refocus and recharge and de-stress. I think that that's all important as it relates to social and emotional learning and self-awareness, managing skills, and social awareness. And then in the community, we have mentoring programs, getting back to hosting conversations and recreational events, social events, and spaces to be. That's for adults and our students alike. Spaces to be who they are, spaces for our students to explore and determine who they want to be, who they want to become. And the pandemic, and it stopped a lot of those things, but we're at a place where we can start getting back to implementing these much needed support systems. And as Brandon mentioned, scaffolding. These are examples of some scaffolding that we can implement as a community in order to support one another and our students in this process of social and emotional learning. And then so the last thing I'll share is 4 things, self-related things that everyone can do. 1, respond to yourself and others. When we're talking about self-awareness and we're thinking about this domain, we have to understand and teach our young people and for ourselves to listen to our own bodies, listen to our minds, listen to the forces within ourselves that's telling us to slow down, to take a break. And so first, respond to yourselves and respond to others. 2, remove phrases that minimize feelings and experiences. My nephew is 17. He lives in North Carolina. And he texted me complaining about my mother and father and his mother, saying, they tell me I'm too young to be stressed, but they don't understand that I have stress. And he's going on and on and on about how folks are constantly telling him that he's too young for fill in the blank. And so number 2 is equally important because we want to do our best to minimize phrases, to remove phrases that minimize and invalidate the experiences of our young people. They are stressed, they are grieving. And then rephrase questions. And so instead of asking, how was your day? You can ask, what subject, what class, was there a teacher that made you angry? What made you smile? What was something today that you're looking forward to following up on tomorrow? Those are questions that give us insight into how our students and our young people are thinking. And then finally, the 4th thing is re-implement those opportunities for students to engage and speak to one another. Students are struggling in our classrooms to actually speak and talk to each other. They're wanting to work on Google Documents instead of verbally speaking in the conversation and the dialogue. So respond, remove, rephrase, and re-implement. Those are 4 R's to consider as we move forward. And so that's all I have. And you all, let's feel free to stay connected. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. And I am going to now pass it on to my other facilitator. And
all right. So thank you, Dr. Kelly. You gave us so much great information, and like we told folks, we knew this was going to be informative. So we're off to a great start. And finally, and certainly last but certainly not least, we'd like to bring on Miss Nikisha Kador. Miss Kador is a restorative practice coach and social and emotional coordinator for New Haven Public Schools. So Ms. Kador, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to share. Let me just pull up this presentation quickly. All right. So you're going to see here in a presentation that it's going to say SEL and restorative practices. Usually we use those interchangeably. They're not 2 separate things. They're kind of like very similar to each other. And so whenever I say restorative practices, just know I kind of mean SEL, and SEL mean restorative practices. All right. So yes, as he said, just a little bit about myself. My name is Nikisha Kador. I graduated from Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte. And I am also, I'm a member of Zeta Phi Beta Incorporated. And I'm also, as he mentioned, a restorative practice coach for the New Haven district, school district. And so I just wanted to introduce a little bit and tell a little bit about me. And so I'm going to share this next slide, but I'll explain a little bit more about why. So why SEL or restorative practices? Here's my family. These are me and all of my siblings. And I believe at the heart of restorative practices and social emotional learning, you have to find your why. That's kind of really what drives this work. And so that's me in the corner, but these are all my siblings and I'm right in the middle. And so
you gotta share your screen.
We don't see.
Oh no. Hold on, I'm sorry. Let's see. Oh, it wasn't sharing that entire time?
Okay. It wasn't that long.
Okay, let's try again. All right. Oh, it's not gonna be a surprise now. All right. So yes, so here's my family. This is me and all 5 of my siblings, and so there's 6 of us. And I share this because I believe that at the heart of SEL and restorative practices, we must know why. And so my why started a long time ago, being the middle child and trying to figure out like who's right and who's wrong. And my mom constantly going back and forth and not really having those skills to really mold and shape us to like understand and communicate. And so I went on this journey to kind of figure out like why things happen and who's right and who's wrong. And so before I start, I wanted to do this activity. You could just drop it in the chat box. because this is really like a mindset kind of thing. And so, hold on, let me close this so I can see you all. Here we go. All right, so right here is an opening activity. And so I'm gonna share a picture, an image on the next slide. And I want you to just think about what is the first thing that you see there. No, there's no right or wrong answer. And I just want you to drop it in the box. And I'll tell you a little bit more why. So for those who can write in, I'm gonna just show you the first thing, whether it's a color, a structure, a shape, a concept, whatever pops up to you, just write it in the chat box. All right, I see a man. Someone says a man. Anything else? And a young man with a hat. Strength. All right, thank you all. Yes, so the reason why I share this picture is because this is normally how I try to channel students' mindsets and even people I encounter with. And I explain it that social emotional learning restorative practices is looking at the same picture and seeing something different. It doesn't make you right or you wrong. It's about being able to see the picture and understand perspective. And so that's why we do that open activity. So thank you all for sharing. All right, if I could just, well, I want to go to the next one. Okay. So yes, so the quote I wanted to share today was, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them. And I just want you to kind of get into that mindset as we go into today's presentation. So what is restorative practices? Restorative practices are proactively build healthy relationships and create community, right? And so when we create community, it allows us to be able to go in and prevent and address harm and wrongdoing. And so what I mean is, the more we know about someone, the more likely we are to not make assumptions and kind of understand where they are. And so in many cases, you might hear someone like might be loud, or someone might just be someone might be short-tempered. And if you spend enough time with them, you get to know them, you'll be like, that's just how they are. And so that comes from us building community, from us being in relationship with each other. It makes it easier for us to understand how those people navigate and then to come together to fix conflict. And so that's ultimately what restorative practice is building community, so that when problems come up that are natural, we're in a space where we know a little bit about each other and we're not making too many assumptions. And this right here, can you all see this bar right here? Is it blocking the presentation? Okay.
No, you're fine.
Okay, so right here, this is Maslow's hierarchy of need. And this right here actually changed my life when I saw it, or I thought back about it. And so what it does is Maslow believed that these 5 different sections here are kind of at the base of what humans need. And so every action that you see, whether it's like someone acting out or someone acting in, right, and being reserved, it's all in an attempt to get a need met. And so the basic needs we will look at are down here: breathing, food, things in that nature. But all of our actions are to get something on this list met. And so the things that we believe are values, they're also meant to, so those ensure that our needs are met individually and collectively. So when we feel like our values are not respected, our needs are not met, that is normally when we come in contact with, we see conflict that occurs with individuals, and they're unable to they feel like they can't get their needs met. And that's when we see conflict arise, right? And so sometimes even like a fear of not getting our need met might actually show up. So we might be in a classroom where a student might be lower on the reading level. And so maybe they're acting out as if like they're being aggressive, or maybe they're just refusing to do work, or maybe they're talking on the side. And so what that is instead of like they're scared that they won't be able to meet the need of completing the work. And so you kind of watch their actions and their reactions come out in other ways. All right, so I wanted to bring some examples, and I tried to get an array of examples just so that, because I really believe restorative practice is about seeing ourselves in this work. And so I tried to get something that might be able to connect with everyone here. And so the first one I had was that a student brings a weapon to school, which we've been seeing a lot in New Haven schools recently, weapons and a lot of like violence between teacher, student kind of thing. And so when we think of things like that, like students bringing weapons to school, it makes me think, what is the need? And when we go back to Maslow, we can identify that there's safety there, right? And so the student is not bringing a weapon in to make the school more unsafe. But what we must understand is that when we look at Maslow's chart, is that they're bringing it into the school because they feel there's a lack of safety. And so this is their way of trying to meet that need of accumulating safety. I'll give you one more example. I don't want to spend too much time on this. So example, this actually happened to me like over the weekend. So I was at someone's house and their 3-year-old writes all over the wall with marker. And they're just like, they're in their bad, terrible, what is it? Terrible 2s, terrible 3 kind of space in their life. And so it's easy for us to see that and just think, oh, this is just a time when they're bad. But when we take restorative practices and SEL, we kind of look at it in a curious way. We think we can then start to examine that it's actually the need to express creativity. And it's not the need to misbehave, but it's them expressing exactly what they need. And I'll leave it at that. But now I want to really get into exactly like why, now that I kind of gave you some background of how this is playing in our school systems overall in New Haven Public Schools, and I think in general. So here's some data right here. We just have, so it says 40% of the students expelled from the US schools each year and are actually 40% Black. And before I go any further, I want to say the thing about this that really disheartens me or makes me really passionate about this work is this document right here was out before the pandemic. And so things haven't really changed much and it's still kind of happening, right? And so also we see students involved in school, not out school, but in school, where school is supposed to be a safe space. Arrests are referred to law enforcement. 70% of those are Black. And so we also think about students, Black students who have been suspended, right? We know that there are 3.5 times more to be higher chance to be suspended. And so on. And so we look into the foster care, juvenile justice system, incarceration, unemployment, and it seems that like Black and brown students are at the center of what's going on out here. And so that leads to New Haven Public Schools, and we're like, what can we do about this? And so recently the government during the pandemic, actually, they awarded school systems in different states over $122 billion in ESSER funds for social emotional learning and education support for the last year and a half that we've actually missed. And we have not been in school. So they started to, now that we've taken these funds, they started to think, how are we rethinking the education system? And how are we thinking about the punitive practices that we are using? We noticed that a lot of students are being suspended. A lot of children are going home. They're doing things like sitting in front of their TV, eating cereal, playing on an iPad, but they're not actually building those social emotional learning skills that we would like them to build in order for them to be able to develop and not have this become a cycle. And so we started to think at the root of this, why are we actually punishing students? Are we punishing students because we want them to go home and be punished? Or is there actually like a lesson that we want them to take out of this? Also, we were thinking, what are the outcomes that are being achieved when students are being punished? Because many times we bring students back after being suspended and we're talking to them and they still never really like built a skill or learned exactly kind of where their mistake was. They weren't held accountable. It was more that they were punished and then they came back, but there was no relational piece with the teacher. And so it consistently happens again and it kind of becomes a cycle. And then we started to think, what are some different outcomes that we desire? Is our goal to really punish our students, or do we want to build stronger communities where children can express how they feel, communities where people are connecting and actually working together? And so with that, we were thinking, what's the difference between punishment and accountability? And I think, well, actually, punishment is just the fact of like giving someone a consequence. And then accountability is having someone think how their actions affected others, but not only that, but going as far as to think, what is the next step? Because in many cases, like I'm gonna talk a little more about that further down the presentation, but many cases we are taught how to talk about how we feel about something, what happened and how we felt about something, but we haven't really looked at how we can be accountable and begin to move towards solutions. And so restorative practices and social emotional learning, think we're moving towards solutions. All right. And so I want to talk a little bit about how this is actually showing up in our school system, which is very interesting and very exciting. This year was actually the first year, I started in August, that they rewrote the code of conduct for New Haven public schools. And so in our code of conduct now, we are making sure that we're really sticking to this relational piece. And we are saying before students can be suspended, there has to be some social emotional learning occurring. There has to be some restorative practices learning, and there has to be that community building piece. And so on a day-to-day, this is really where we're focusing right now. There are 3 tiers, but we're really focusing. I also heard our second presenter speak on this. I'm sorry, I don't want to forget say your name the wrong way. But right now we're focusing on building community through community building circles. And so those circles are really, really important for just making that connection. So we're focusing right now, we're doing this in all New Haven public schools, but we're hoping to build community through circles, because eventually those circles, when students are sitting there and they're able to discover that they've all kind of experienced maybe bullying or being left out or feeling unheard or being unsupported, and being able to be in community and share that affect, that those facial expressions, then hear each other's stories, it makes them lean in. And when you lean in the community, then it makes it much easier for us to get to tier 2, which will be intervention management inside the classroom of the teacher talking about these things, because there's that natural connection. And then the tier 3 would be like serious harm, meaning like conferences. But we even want to make that more intentional, meaning that conferences are no longer just like a conference with a principal and maybe a teacher and you get sent home, but conferences, we want to be intentional about bringing the student in, the classmates that may have been affected, parents, teachers, people that love them, because restorative practices and social emotional learning is about making a mistake and learning with the community around you to support you to build those skills. And so that's what we're doing in New Haven public schools right now. And this right here, it says intellectual arguments about fairness and rights or wrongs bypass their personal experience. And basically what I mean by that is what I said earlier, is that the less we know about each other, the easier it is for us to make assumptions, right? So intellectual arguments, I mean, we can debate all the time, but everyone has like a different experience. But if we can get into a space where we're hearing each other's personal experience, like we did at that picture, where we just see how everyone sees something different and we listen to this experience, and it doesn't mean anyone's is less or anyone's is more, then we move into a space where we can start to come together and find solutions together. And it also changes the direction of the conversation, right? It promotes empathy. It's hard to kind of not care about someone who you've already leaned in and kind of heard their story and know much more about. And me, I'm big on stories. Hold on one second. I'm big on stories, and I was thinking, what could I leave? What could I leave this presentation with? That may be like a quick story or funny story or something that you could refer back to yourself. And so I was reading this book. I changed the characters' names a little because I can't remember the characters. I gave the book away last week to someone. But the story really stuck with me, and I still remember it. I want to share it with you, or the mindset, right? So there's this aunt. There's a character in the book, and she has an aunt, right? Her aunt's name is Jackie, and Aunt Jackie has this old bed, right? This old bed has been in the family forever. It's been in there for 50 years. The bed is worn down, right? And her niece Nikki is just like, this is getting out of control. You need to get rid of this bed. We need to get you a new bed, right? And so the aunt is like, I feel like Nikki is just controlling and doesn't respect my personal space. She's trying to get me this new bed, right? And then the author goes over to Nikki's perspective, and we're like, okay, so how is Nikki seeing this? And we notice that Nikki has some concerns, right? She's like, she wants her aunt, she thinks that her aunt is being stubborn, and she just like wants to be stuck in her ways of keeping these things for 50 years, right? And so then the author walks us to the next set of this, and I guess if you want, you can write this in the chat. Who is right or wrong, right? Who's right or wrong? And so immediately it gets you into the space where you're ready to choose who's right or wrong. But what we notice is the author provides a little more information. So we find out that the reason why Aunt Jackie won't get rid of her old bed is because she had this bed for 50 years, and her husband recently passed away a few years ago. And it was the only thing in her life that kind of remained the same. So it was that stability for her, right? And so when she sat and she's telling Nikki this, then Nikki shares that she notices that the bed no longer was like serving her, that it could potentially make her lose her mobility. It was causing health effects. And so this is what restorative practices and social emotional is all about, because in many cases we're looking and saying, who's right, who's wrong? Is Aunt Jackie right? Is Nikki right? Or who's wrong? And the truth is, where restorative practices, our goal is to sit down and decide, what do we need from each other? So it's hard to, once you know the history behind that bed, to tell Aunt Jackie, cut it out and let's throw it away. And it kind of allows us to be in community and understand more about each other. And so overall, I just wanted to remind everybody of the goals of social emotional learning and restorative practices. And then I'll give you my last hurrah, and then we'll take some questions. So the goal of social emotional learning and restorative practices, I want you guys to keep in mind, is always to build relationships. Building relationships is the key to social emotional learning. Also, the goal is also to problem solve, right? Many times we stay in a space of thinking about what happened and how we felt, but we want to initially get to that third step of thinking, how do we problem solve? How do we move forward in a way that feels comfortable, in a way that feels okay for everyone? Also, the goal is to express our needs and understand the needs of others. And as we see in an example I just shared, and also build empathy and teach problem solving. Building empathy is so important. When someone leans in, when someone hears your story, it gives them more context to who you are, and it allows you two to work together in an even more collective way. And it teaches problem solving. So 3 steps that you can implement today. I would say for everyone here is being vulnerable, right? Vulnerability is key. One of the first things, going back to the second slide with just myself, is not leading with your ego. And so to do social emotional learning, to really step into this, means to not take things personal, but goes into the second thing, leading with curiosity, right? Not assuming that we know what's going on with someone, but asking, hey, what's going on? Or hey, what's making you choose these things or make these actions? And a way that normally I use this at home, I use this at school, I use this in my neighborhood, I use it to figure out why I'm stuck in life. I use this last model for everything, but thinking about like when you, or I would substitute when you for what happened. And then I would talk about how I felt and I need. And so an example would be like, let's use a student not taking their hat off. So in class, because it seems to be like a constant thing that comes up. So when you don't take your hat off, I feel like I'm not connected to you. I can't really see your eyes. I need you to take your hat off so I feel connected. And it allows people to talk about what they did and how it made you feel, which is our vulnerability. But also the most important thing is what you need, because that is what we need to be in community with each other. And so the quote I'll leave you with today is, no significant learning can happen without a significant relationship, by James Comer. And thank you all for listening. Any questions? There you go.
Thank you. So, that was great. We got lots of information, and our panelists were prepared and knowledgeable as advertised. So now this is the part of the presentation where we ask for audience participation. We ask that the audience, if you drop your comments or questions in the chat. And so, I will turn it over to Brother Ruel Dixon to see if we have anything in the chat for us yet.
Yes, we have one question so far. And the question states, have you encountered any challenges with the values that students learn at home based on their cultural background? And since Mr. Frame unmuted first, you could go ahead and anyone else could chime in.
Yeah, actually, I wouldn't say any challenges. I think in my work at the Urban Assembly, like to do this work, we've developed software. I'm not here to make a sales pitch around what we do. So, but with that, we've worked with schools. So I'll tell the story of a school. This is a school I work with in Boston. And so we've introduced, social emotional learning and social emotional learning assessment. So students are able to assess on their social emotional learning skills. So that way we can put things in place and organize the school around developing the skills that students have strengths in, as well as areas for growth. But with that, and thinking about, as I shared with the culturally sustaining approach, we had a SEL night for parents. And so the parents, 50, 60 parents came in to our social emotional learning night. And what the purpose was, that in terms of how we pitched it, was for the parents to be introduced to social emotional learning skills in an explicit and intentional way, in terms of here's the skill, here's the competency and the indicators that accompany that competency. And then we had, of the 60 parents, we had about 15 different ethnicities and cultures that were represented from the Caribbean to Southeast, this Pacific Islands and whatnot. And in their groups with their cultures, whether they were by themselves or the ones that we have multiple representatives, we looked at those skills and behaviors that will accompany that skill, and then identify what would that look like in their community. So that way, when that was brought back to teachers, as students set goals around how they wanted to improve around their social emotional skills, teachers were not necessarily maybe taken aback and or said, maybe that's not the type of goal I'm looking for, but specifically to that community, that is what self-awareness may look like. That is what self-management may look like in particular communities. And so I would say that it's not necessarily a challenge, but more so taking an approach of looking at how you introduce these competencies and these skills, and then look at different cultures and figure out what do some of these things look like in those cultures. And then you can bring that into the school so that everyone is aware of what is happening when students do certain things as they set goals and look to build their social emotional skills.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Kelly or Nikisha, you want to tackle that one?
I will say that a challenge or an area of opportunity, I'll say an area of opportunity that I've seen around social emotional learning is connected to students whose parents have their goals and the things that they want their children to accomplish. And I'm going to tiptoe around this because I am not a parent. I'm an educator. I'm an auntie of 8 nephews and 1 niece. And so I hear all the time from my niece and my nephews, but then also from my students, how their parents have a script and things that they want them to do. Specifically from my students who are into sports, they may play sports for their local high school, and then they're playing for AAU, and and on top of that, they have like one of the students mentioned, they may be a part of Jack and Jill, they may be a part of other social organizations. They have all of these things lined up and scripted. Some of these students are even asked or expected to take college classes while they are sophomores. And so when I'm talking about their values based on culture in the African American community, most of the students that are trying to juggle or dealing with the stressors of juggling all of these different things are my African American students. And on the other side, my Latino and Latina students are working multiple jobs to try to help their family and contribute. So these are values that my students are bringing into the classroom. So when I, as their teacher, want to have conversations around the expectation in the coursework and the workload in the classroom, it is challenging for them to try to figure out and manage time, which leads to how they interact and their behaviors that manifest in the classroom and the back and forth that may occur. So those are some areas which takes a different approach than what Brandon presented, but it's a tension nonetheless that based on culture I've seen in the classroom.
Great, thank you for that. Okay. So Ruel, I'll turn it back over to Ruel.
All right. The next question for restorative practice. How important is it to involve teachers, staff, and family?
I would say very, very, very important. I mean, I work for the district, and like, even when I'm going to schools, I make it my business to, when I'm meeting with students, and it's hard to get through, just connecting with the families. I think there's a big disconnect with the families as far as with social emotional learning in schools and the families. And I think that if we were able to connect them and really build those relationships, then the students will be more supported. And so, yes, so I definitely believe that you should involve teachers, staff. We're trying to do that by getting them on board of doing restorative circles and having these conversations, because initially, I think at the heart of it is important for students to see their teachers, the staff, and their families as human beings, right? Because we're trying to have this human relationship or connection that we're building. And so I think the more people that are involved in the community or the supports around them that are involved, the more powerful this work can be. So absolutely.
If I can add, I agree. It's imperative that we have all of the stakeholders, the folks involved. And also, I think, too, folks that want to and are willing to be involved and do the work, because I implemented restorative practices at the collegiate level, or tried to, and the teachers and the faculty were unwilling to come around and have those conversations. If you don't have a teacher who is willing to come to a restorative circle and have the conversations and show those supports, and also be willing to accept that the student is taking accountability and willing to develop the skills needed to self-manage and to change their behaviors, then we run the risk of possibly causing more harm to the student and to the teacher than good. And so I think absolutely we need all stakeholders around the table, but folks need to be willing and ready to do that work and participate in those conversations.
So and thank you for that. But just for just a clarification, just when we talk about stakeholders, can you all share what you mean by stakeholders?
So when I use the word stakeholders, I'm referring to, in many cases, a lot of our schools have paraprofessionals. A lot of our schools have part-time staff that come in that may not necessarily have day-to-day interactions with students, but are able to lend some valued support. Stakeholders, people outside in the community who have resources that can help support a student with where they may see themselves going in their lives. And so that may mean that we're reaching out to community leaders. If a student has expressed that they're interested in something and they don't find an outlet or a way for them to connect in the school, making sure that we're reaching outside of, let's say, our school buildings, or reaching outside of the district if we don't have access to, let's say, internships or mentorship programs or things like that that can help support our students develop these skills that we're talking about. And so that's what I'm referring to when I say, stakeholders.
Yeah. Just to add to that, I like to I like to, I'm really big on like analogies and to get my point across with certain things. So when I think about stakeholders, I think about like everybody's on Zoom. So what that means is that most likely everybody here, there might be a few people that are standing up because people like to stand up. I've seen those standing desks, but for the most, we're all sitting in a chair. And when I think of stakeholders, I think about the chairs that we're sitting in, and there's 4 stakeholders. There's the community, there's a student, there's parents, and then there's that school/district, right? And when one of them, when one of those chair you sit in, probably got 4 legs. When one leg is not strong and not there, then the thing falls apart. So when we think about stakeholders, think about that table, think about that chair. It's got those 4 legs, and all need to be present and accounted for in order to move the work and move our communities forward.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, because I know a lot of times maybe it's written down in our fancy brochures and websites, but sometimes people may have a different definition of stakeholders. And particularly where I'm at ACES, we serve, we have a partnership with 26 different school districts, but we serve over 60 towns. So, our list of stakeholders grows because we're talking about fee for services, superintendents, and board of eds and things of that nature. So stakeholders may look different, but I just wanted to give it some context. So thank you for that. I'll turn it over back to Brother Dixon.
All right. Another question. So Brandon provided a definition of SEL from 1997. Why 25 years later are we seeing it as a major component of education?
I'll share a few thoughts that I have. What we've done with K through 12 education in the United States of America, maybe really the country, but definitely the United States of America, is that we've put a hyper focus on solely academics. One way to put that into perspective is that I'm looking at everyone here that does have their cameras on. If we go back to when we were in high school, and even if you go to high schools today, you can walk into Wilbercross, we can walk into Hill House, we can walk into all the different schools across New Haven Public Schools. And if we stop any student and we ask them, how are you doing academically? What are your strengths, your challenges and needs? And every single student will be able to articulate, even the student that comes to school, 50% of the time will be able to tell you their academic skills, their strengths, their challenges and needs. Now, if we walk through New Haven Public Schools and we go to the different schools and we ask students, what social emotional skill are you working on? How do you use it to learn? How to use it in your community? What are your social emotional strengths, challenges, and needs? Every student can answer that question, right? And so that is the challenge that is ahead of us, is that how do we create communities? I'm gonna phrase it like this, because this is New Haven. What would New Haven, not just New Haven Public Schools, what would New Haven look like if every single human being in New Haven could talk about their social emotional skills, their strengths, challenges, and needs alongside their academic skills in terms of their strengths, challenges, and needs? What would New Haven look like, right? What type of community would it be if everyone could do that? And so that starts, with what we're doing in our schools. And so, but what we've done is that, again, I've alluded to, like, oh, but everybody can, even everyone here, when you were in high school, if somebody walked up to you in high school and asked you, how you doing with your academics? How you doing in school? You can answer that, right? Everybody here in school did not get that explicit and intentional development of their social emotional skills. And so it's really important for all of us to really take that approach as we move forward, to think about, like, how am I going to intentionally develop? If I got a program for young men, how am I intentionally and explicitly developing these skills that kids will be able to come back and say, the social emotional skill that I'm working on is self-awareness. When I'm in the Omega Sci-Fi, mentoring program, I work on this and I use it in my school. I use it at school and I use it in my community, and it helps me do that. Right? That should be our outcome in terms of what kids, young people, young men should be able to articulate back to us based off of the teaching that we're doing to them.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, Ruel.
All right, so I have a question. So oftentimes when we're talking about SEL interventions, right, it talks about some remediation of some type of skills, right? And a lot of times where the process of remediating these skills is always slow, right? And it doesn't really match up to what the stakeholders may feel. So what are the messages that you give to stakeholders, especially when the behaviors that are associated with a skill deficit are so disruptive or explosive in the academic environment? What are the messages that you give to stakeholders to essentially stay with a plan and not, expel a student or suspend a student or otherwise?
Well, recently, I know we're supported by that because we have the new code of conduct, which says that principals are not able to really just go directly to suspension. In the past, it's been like, if this happens, you can just go. But now, if there's something serious that happens, like there's a weapon that was brought in school or something in that nature, then the student is probably open to suspension. But before those things, if it's not that serious of a safety issue, we're just making sure that they are holding the code of conduct up, and we are tracking the circles that we're doing. We also have different assessments that we're handing out in the beginning of the school year, in the middle of the school year, and at the end to see how we're progressing. So we're just trying to hold people accountable, and also share the message of what progress we have and the tracking that we have to share back with the stakeholders, so we can kind of like stay aligned and continue to string this work along and grow it and like Kelly said, get people on board who are interested in being a part of the movement.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that. I think that, for the state of Connecticut, and Nikisha, I'm not sure if you're doing this yet in New Haven. If not, I can definitely share, with the contacts with you. But the state of Connecticut purchased a social emotional learning assessment for the entire state. So like every district in the state of Connecticut has access to the DESA, which is a social emotional learning assessment. And I think what's really important is, to your question, is that we're not across the country are not necessarily adequately measuring students' social emotional skills through SEL assessment, right? So like when we're talking the things that I've mentioned, right, is like well, where do students fall in terms of their decision making, right? Like that's what we have to assess, right? And see, okay, where do you fall in these different spaces, and then plan to move forward. Because I think you made a great point in terms of, okay, I see these different behaviors, and then what I would raise up is that, okay, I'm seeing certain behaviors, got it. This is impacting academics for that student as well as other students. But in terms of that student that's displaying the behavior, when I'm walking in schools and I'm talking with people, I'm asking like, okay, well, I see this student displaying certain behaviors consistently, right? And I'm wondering, well, when were they actually taught the actual right thing to do, right? So let's just take this. I'm gonna use a classroom example, right? So if everybody here has had to do an assignment in school, at some point, everybody's in school, you got to do an assignment, right? And you turned it in late, but you got everything right, right? And so that means that you understand the content, but you turned it in late. That's a social emotional skill, right? So you got penalized for your lack of social emotional skill, even though you know the content. So even when it comes to behaviors, we have kids that are displaying behaviors. And so I wonder, oh, well, when was that student taught a particular skill? Because a lot of times people just assume, especially when you get to high school, well, they should just know. Like when you start doing this work, right? You go to a high school and the school will say, okay, this student needs to work on resolving conflicts. Let's just say we'll just call it that, right? Which is social awareness. And then so I was like, okay, well, when did the student learn how to resolve conflicts? High school teachers and people would say, well, they should have learned that in middle school. So then go over to middle school. That's middle school. So did you teach students how to resolve conflicts? Middle school, probably like, no, we didn't really teach students how to resolve conflict. Oh, so well, if they didn't learn in middle school, when should they have learned it? Oh, elementary school. And so maybe they learned it in elementary school, but then it wasn't practiced. It wasn't reinforced year after year after year. And then you get to high school and now we're penalizing kids for something that they really didn't actually learn. Or was it reinforced over time? And then we're just seeing behaviors. And then that just creates the school to prison pipeline that we see, because we know once you get to high school and you exhibit certain behaviors, that in elementary school, okay, we could work, we work with you, sit you in timeout. In high school, or once you leave high school and you exhibit certain behaviors, but we know where you end up, right? And so this is where SEL comes into on a systemic level, right? To make sure that what you just mentioned doesn't happen, but are we actually teaching those skills that will keep those are we teaching those skills to create pro-social behaviors as opposed to some of the behaviors that we do see, inside of our schools that lead to the school to prison pipeline?
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in, or we can move on?
I have one interesting question here.
Okay.
With a restorative practice approach, is it important for teachers and staff to be of the same demographic or community of the student for it to be most effective?
No, not necessarily. I think that the teacher or the person who's hosting or facilitating just has to be open to being like vulnerable and like human, because children can sense that, and so can adults. And so they don't necessarily have to be from the same demographic. That right there would be more helpful. But as long as someone is willing to be open to being vulnerable and sharing their experiences and respecting and listening to other experiences, then that pretty much is the heart of it. It's more restorative practices is more about being human and opening up and being vulnerable to share your stories and your experiences around different things, and also being willing to be intentional and listen to others. So not necessarily.
Okay. Dr. Kelly?
I agree wholeheartedly. I think that when we think about demographics, there are some things that I have in common. I heard Brandon mention going into Hill House. I'm a proud graduate, Hill House class of 1999. And there are some things and some experiences growing up in New Hallville that I have with some of the students that I teach. And at the same time, my upbringing drastically differs from some of the students that I teach, and I'm not able to make those connections and those rapports and develop a rapport on that level. And so I think it's important to, as Nikisha mentioned, be able to be honest, to be able to understand and recognize our own biases as educators and as a teacher. I understand that there are certain things when I go into meetings and I'm having conversations with my students, I'm going in with preconceived notions sometimes. I'm going in with my own experiences all the time. I'm going in with my blinders in many cases, and how I am always going to go the extra mile for, I like to say, the students who have been counted out. And that is a bias that I have, and I have to check that. And I think that that's equally important when we're talking about implementing SEL and restorative practices. Being able to acknowledge them and then check our biases, I think those are equally as important.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned biases, because we all, especially when we do this work with young people in education, but in general, right, when we do equity work, it's really important that we all acknowledge our biases. And if we're saying we don't have biases, then we haven't really done that self-reflection, or don't necessarily have that self-awareness. But like to your point, Dr. Kelly, and we know them, then we're able to check them and move forward in an equitable way. But let me say in response to that question, so we're saying we don't necessarily have to be the same demographic or the same community. However, what's been the experience with the teachers or the educators or the adults who have pushed back and who haven't accepted this practice of restorative, right? Like, you know what, I don't have time for a circle. This kid is a pain, but I want him or her suspended. So what's been the experience there?
I will say, as a high school teacher, that a lot of that comes from some of the things that I mentioned around the things that we're all experiencing as humans, and this feelings of underappreciation, being overworked, and undervalued. And so when you've had conversations, and Brandon gave an example about a student handing in assignments late, I chuckled, because if I look at my Google Classroom right now, I have assignments from January that students are saying, Dr. Hope, you didn't grade it. I said it was due in January. And so we have to have a conversation around, why did you turn it in late? And understand that I will take a look at it when I have time, because I'm grading current things. And I think that some of those tensions that teachers have that may not be of the same demographics stems from some frustrations, and that's personal. And a lot of times also, I've also seen specifically, and I'm trying to not get myself in any trouble here. I've heard students discuss and talk about teachers who are not African American or from the African diaspora, and talk about how these teachers do not give any latitude, are not supportive, do not want to have those conversations or provide room for students to, let's say, turn in work late or be at the tables for these mediations and these conversations in circles. And so I think that that definitely plays an impact. And a lot of those teachers, if a student says, I don't understand, they'll say, well, you should have been paying attention, and then they'll move forward, which then causes the student to act out in class, which then causes a log or a write-up. And then it may escalate if the student gets a number of logs or write-ups in a week. And so I do think that there is a correlation between teachers, in many cases, that are not of the same demographic in their response to students who are experiencing some challenges in the classroom.
Right.
So,
thank you.
And I would ask a question. If I don't know if you guys are familiar with Dr. Feldman and his grading for equity framework, right? And we're basically talking about grading for equity, and he's saying that as teachers, we shouldn't be grading a student's behavior. We should be grading the work that they turn in. So speaking specifically to a student turning in that work late and not knowing necessarily what's going on at home or anything like that, which may call for that assignment being late, right? That is something that Dr. Feldman would like, he may think that that's not appropriate to be grading that taking away points for late work because we're grading for that behavior. So what would be your message to that mindset as it relates for grading for equity?
So personally, I think, around grading for equity, I think there's two different things. So at my particular school, we have two grades. One grade is called a responsibility grade, and then the other is an academic grade. And so responsibility it's connected to the work was turned in late, and so you may not get the credit for responsibility. You were responsible, so that's the conversation. And so the work will get graded and it will count. However, the conversation must be had connected to one's inability or decision to not communicate what was happening or why it was late or asking for an extension. And I think it goes back to who taught the students how to communicate and say, I need an extension or whatever is happening. And so that's built in. I lucked out and I'm working at a school that already has those things built into our curriculum and how we navigate and maneuver. But my response as an educator is absolutely, I agree. As an educator, as a teacher who's doing the work, who is experiencing some of the same things that students are experiencing, it's it will be graded, it will count, but not on your time, on my time, and we're going to have a conversation as people, so that way we can understand and we can begin to teach those skills about simply because you turn something in when you want to doesn't mean that someone is going to respond when you want them to. And so it's a conversation, I think, that has to happen between the teacher and the student.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think, a little one when I was sharing like the definition, and I was like, oh, I got the synonym right. And so I think, I appreciate you sharing that framework. And then like also my response to that would be, and to build off what was just shared, is that that behavior is a skill. So let's just say that we continue not to address that. What does that look like as an adult? And where can you go and do that as an adult? I don't know too many places where you can, turn something in when you want to, turn it in late, show up late, right? And so I look at a lot of things. I center a lot of this work around skills, and we're developing skills. And to add that to an equity lens, right, is that, well, what happens when students, all people, are at least above average in all these, what somebody might call a behavior that I would say is a skill? What happens when you're above average in all those skills? And then what type of opportunities do you have access to? What type of jobs can you get? So that's just something I want to build on with what was shared, and thinking about, again, certain behaviors, if not majority of behaviors, is actual skills. And so what are we witnessing in terms of the skill that a student needs to build, that might be a strength and we harness that, or a student that has a skill that is an area for growth that we need to think about how we help them get better at it.
All right, and then the final question that we have for tonight is, during the pandemic, many companies reevaluated the way they were doing business, ranging from changing their hours, raising wages, and partial and complete remote work. Education seemingly went back to business as normal. Did we miss an opportunity to do education better, or at the very least differently?
I will say overall, if I'm looking at the state of education holistically, I will say yes, absolutely. There's still an opportunity though for districts and schools to really tap into the need to develop infrastructure around distance learning and online learning. That infrastructure we were kind of thrust into at the onset of the pandemic. And now that things are back to normal, and I'm using that very loosely because there's nothing normal about the way teaching is happening right now, even still. But I think that making sure that we find a way to provide opportunities for students to not only continue their education, but to be able to do so in an online form. I think there's also an opportunity for us to revisit even school hours for some students. And so holistically, I will say that we did not seize the moment fully as a profession, as a field. But I can also say that I am aware in the New Haven Public School District, specifically my school, that there are some students that have been afforded the opportunity to come to school part days or come to school for the classes that they need and not have to be in school from 7:50 to 2:30. They can come for their classes and then they can go and do what it is that they need to do because they're juggling and dealing with a lot of things due to maybe the loss of loved ones. And there's some students that are New Haven Public School students, but they're doing their learning from home even still, and they have tutors at home with them. And so from my perspective, I do think holistically, we did not seize that moment. We did not maximize the moment to provide versatility. But I do know that there are pockets where there have been some changes that were implemented that have been sustainable up to this point.
Thank you. All right. So so we're coming to the end of our program, and like they say, time flies when you're having fun. So what we'll do is we'll give each of our panelists an opportunity to kind of close us out with a last word, and then I'll share an announcement, and then we'll close out the program that way. So I guess we can go in the order in which we started. So I'll give Brandon opportunity for a last thought.
Last thought. Social emotional learning is, or what we like to say here at the Urban Assembly is all learning is social and emotional. So it's important to embrace and know that all learning invokes emotional reaction. So how do we help students develop the skills to navigate learning and to navigate a complex society when it comes to their social emotional development? That's important, it's needed. And if we really think about how we can organize ourselves around the principles of social emotional learning so that we can implement, sustain, evaluate, and integrate, we can really make sustainable communities. One fact that I like to share is that 77% of people live within 15 miles of where they grew up in the United States of America, right? And so with that being the case, think about the young people right now across New Haven schools or in the New Haven community. And if we ask people to put their hands up, a lot of people from, New Haven or the greater New Haven area, the state of Connecticut, right? And so that's why social emotional skills are important, because these are the skills that allow us to live and thrive in community with each other. And so we have to make sure we focus on it, we do it and develop the skills in an intentional and explicit way, because that will allow for our communities to thrive.
Thank you. Very powerful words. So Dr. Kelly, you're still in that middle, right? You either way, you're second, right?
Yeah. So my parting words are simply that developing these social and emotional skills, they're not just for our students, they're for everyone. And I think that as adults, as we evolve, as we grow, as we come to know ourselves in different stages of life, we come to understand that there are some areas where we may find that we can use some sharpening, we can use some tweaking. And so my parting thoughts are simply that social emotional learning isn't just for students and just in the classroom, but it is for everyone, and something that I think we all should constantly be checking our social and emotional barometers and our meters to see where we are and how we can grow and become better at interacting with others.
Thank you very much. And it's that check-in is like very, very important. And we talk about that. That's what our education be doing with our kids every day, right? That check-in, that mood meter and all those different things. All right. And so Nikisha, we'll let you have the last word as for our panelists anyway.
The last word I like to leave you all with is just stay curious. Stay curious whenever you're seeing behaviors, whenever you're seeing, just when you're at home. It's social emotional learning is a lifestyle. And so remember that whenever you're having challenges or frustrations that are coming up, those are opportunities to practice restorative practices and social emotional learning. So stay curious, and whenever you're in a situation where you're just trying to navigate it, ask why is this happening? Don't forget Maslow. And if you forget Maslow, don't be afraid to go back to Google and just try to figure out where on a chart that is. And so that's the words I will leave you with. Thank you.
So listen, you sound like you were designing the t-shirt. You said social emotional learning is a lifestyle. So we can talk offline about that business venture. All right.
Okay.
So listen, I just want to take another opportunity again to thank our panelists for the powerful words, the expertise, and your knowledge, people that are living this work and doing this work. So thank you very much for being here. I would like to thank the audience for tuning in. I see some familiar names who are here every month, but I also want to thank the brothers of Omega Psi Phi who tuned in from across the district and the country, and thank our audience, because without you, we would probably just be having another committee meeting. So we just hope that you got something out of this. Very quickly, our next community conversation of the Omega Uplift Series will be held on Wednesday, April 20th at 6 p.m. So please keep your ears out. The title, A Conversation on Black Theology from the Christian Perspective. So again, that's a good one. Another powerful segment that you don't want to miss. And my last thing is I just want to say thank you to the Social Action Committee, Gigi Martindale, Livy Spearman, Craig Streeter, Anthony Charles, Alex Jones, Ruel Dixon, Nasiki Reed, Reverend Sam Ross Lee, Dave Cockrell, and Jordan Johnson. People may think that it's easy for us to just kind of turn on this Zoom and do this, but it takes a lot of planning for us to do this. It's a lot of back and forth with our panelists. It's a lot of putting up with the bros. So as you know, that's a haze in itself, but it's the work that we love. It's the work that we have to do, and it's part of what we do. So I want to say thank you. I will turn over for our boss list, AJ, to close us out.
Thank you, Brother Walton. Again, just want to reiterate the sentiments to our panelists. Thank you for not only your information, your wealth of knowledge, but also your time. To everyone that joined us, good night, and thank you for attending.
Yeah, please, and take care of yourselves, right? We're all overwhelmed, and I think Kelly mentioned that, so please take care of yourself. Self-care is very important. So if you see me at the manicure, pedicure spot, mind your business. All right, good night, everyone. Brothers, we staying on?
Yeah, just for a minute.
Right.
Thank you again, and good night.
All right. Good night, everyone.